Hey, this is Dave from Power Trip, and this is Power Tripping, a chance for the Symposia team to deep dive into recent episodes. We're a 501c3 nonprofit psychedelic watchdog organization. You can support our work at symposia.com/donate. You can listen to Power Trip wherever pods are cast, and tune in here for the real dope on the psychedelic renaissance.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Power Tripping. We're a bunch of power trippers. Yay! No, in all seriousness, we're here to talk a bit about the latest episode of New York Magazine and Symposia's Power Trip podcast. And this latest episode got into a couple of different things, but I think the place we want to really dive deeply is Roquette, Salvador Roquette.
What episode are we talking about, Lily?
Episode 4.
Yeah, Bad
What's
Hug.
it called?
It's called Bad
Hug.
Hug.
Okay.
And I think before we get into Roquette, we just want to give a huge shout out to Whitney Jones, who put together the audio montage at the opening of Bad Hug. I want to say that it was a very authentic roketamine experience, sort of derived from interviews with folks who did some of the DJing for Roquette, as well as based on the reports of different people who have experienced some of those soundscapes. So,
yeah, that was not a recording. You might have say again, Russ.
Oh, just that we all had something good to say about that intro.
Totally. If I didn't know otherwise, I would have thought it was like, a recording from the actual events.
How did he set that up? Was it like multiple tape decks and multiple sound systems?
Roquette?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's actually a YouTube with a guy named Jim Lehrman, who we can put a link to that in the show notes, who talks a little bit about that. And so in addition to like tape decks and records and whatnot, there was also there was like a whole control booth basically, and they would walk around at some points with like microphones and play people back to themselves on a delay. So like the level of like thought that went into manipulating audio in real time in ways to sort of disorient people and provide like a multi-layered sensorial experience.
That particular claim has been made and also contested by the same people. So we're not totally sure about the recording and playing back. But I have read in multiple places that, like, if not played back in the sessions, like played back the next day during the integration session. And so, it's a little hard to like have a exact, like crystal clear window into what was going on in these sessions. But I think we have a pretty vivid picture of at least some of it. And to be fair, like, I think that it's safe to say that Roquette and his methods are contested, that there are different people who have different takes on what his work was about and what he was doing and have different ways of talking about it. So some describe his engagement with student dissidents as torture and others as his efforts to make them better citizens and try to help them in some way and treat them, which I find creepier, to be honest with you, than just calling it torture. But and then there are people who sort of deny that it was ever done at all, and then others who say it was only done because he was under threat of arrest, which is like,
I only tortured them because they were going to arrest me.
Yeah.
And I think too, like with regards to the claims as far as the recordings or other things where you've got the same people on the record making different statements, like paying attention to who they're speaking with in those interviews also matters, because there's this interesting phenomenon where when folks think that they're among friends or among people who are going to give them the benefit of the doubt or accept some of their characterizations, they may speak more freely than when they realize that they're speaking to an outside audience, potentially those who may have critical responses to what's being advanced. And I think this comes up in something that I think we'll get into a little later in this episode, but as far as how people characterize what the therapy versus the tortures looked like, were like what they qualified as. So I think remembering that like Roquette is a character who has not been discussed widely in psychedelic spaces, and that the way that he has been discussed has been curated largely by his acolytes or supporters, people who
or
may
his
have had.
devotees.
Sure.
Okay, so I know that episode 4 gets into who Salvador Roquet is, and we're talking about him right now, but can you guys kind of tell me who he is a little bit?
Please.
Yeah, who's Roquette? And I was also curious if were you aware of Roquette prior to this research, and kind of what were you aware of him when, like before getting into Francoise and all of these people who kind of consider themselves his legacy?
I think probably the starting place for that is Lily's encounter of Roquette in Francois' book, and I'll let you tell that story and jump in.
Sure. I mean, it was July of 2020, and after talking with Susan extensively and starting to think differently about my experience in that circle of, knowing a bunch of people that they had trained, I decided to read Francoise Borzat's book. And that was a journey. I wouldn't call it a shamanic healing journey, but it was a journey. And partway through, I got to this 1 or 2 paragraphs that was talking about her lineage and her work with Pablo Sanchez and her work with Salvador Roquet, and a description of his methods, particularly around the sensory overload and the sleep deprivation. So I shuffled. I was sitting at this computer in this room, so I shuffled across that floor, through that door, and out to where Dave was sitting. And I said, "Dave, please tell me if you think I'm a little like off base here, but doesn't this sound like some MK Ultra shit to you?"
I think you actually said tell me if you think I'm being paranoid or totally crazy. There was a significant disclaimer.
Yeah, it
but
was
yeah,
like it was like a concern of being like a conspiracy theorist or something. So then Dave, in his wonderful wisdom and knowledge of the extensive literature, was like, let's see what Martin Lee has to say about it in Acid Dreams.
Yeah, so I broke out Acid Dreams because that's just like, I would say, sort of still the authoritative work on psychedelic authoritarianism in a lot of senses. And sure enough, I searched Roquette, and there was like 2 hits, and there's a footnote or an end note in the index that says, whereas most psychedelic therapists were prepared to assist their patients should difficulties arise, Dr. Salvador Roquette, a maverick Mexican psychiatrist, consciously sought to induce a bummer as part of his treatment. Roquette utilized various hallucinogenic drugs, including LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, datura, and ketamine. Known as a master of bad trips and a pusher of death, Roquette subjected people to adverse stimuli while they were drugged. Jewish subjects, for example, were given acid and then forced to listen to a recording of Hitler's speeches. So when we read that, it was just kind of like, oh shit. Because in addition to seeing that quite clear, I mean, what struck me as a rather concerning passage, I think based on some of what Lily had read, there were questions about similarities to you and Cameron and some of the depatterning or psychic driving techniques, which I think a lot more people are familiar with Cameron and sort of MK Ultra and that type of abuse and the legacy of it. So suddenly stumbling upon this character, Roquette, who neither of us had heard of, I think, prior to that reading was suddenly like, wait, who the hell is this person, and how deep is their connection to MK Ultra or similar ideologies?
And then as far as like just a couple of really basic facts, I suppose, if that's, I think that's according to what we've read, he started working in Mexico in 1967. And his work was suspended in 1974. He was arrested on November 21st, 1974, and released from prison in 1975. There's one reference to him like going off into the mountains to hang out with the Mazatec and like disappearing for a while. He claims to be in the lineage of Maria Sabina and to have like worked with her and been trying to translate her veladas to a industrialized or Western context. And then, at some point he started to hang out in the U.S. So his second arrest was actually in Addison County, Vermont, on September 5th, 1977. And that was so the first arrest in Mexico in 1974 was at his clinic. And my understanding is that it was with a bunch of patients under the influence of psychedelics in his session. And then the Addison County, Vermont arrest was also people under the influence. And there was like LSD and ketamine and I think something else present.
And that was one where there had been, as I understand it, some interactions between him and Tim Leary prior to that, where his hosts basically said, don't tell Leary what we're doing, don't give him a heads up of what's going on. I think at that point there were questions about how heavily surveilled Leary was. As I understand it, Roquette wasn't able to contain himself, told Leary about what was going on, and then the bust followed.
Yeah, but they canceled the event that Roquette was actually talking about, but he still wanted to offer something to the people who wanted it. And so there's also contested like numbers about how many people he treated. Like, there's one person, Villaloldo says that he trained over 600 patients. Dawson says over 8 years he held 764 sessions. Over 813 patients were treated. Then there's Alvarez, who's his nephew, who says that he did 720 sessions, which treated 1,700 patients. And pretty universally across the board, I'll read what Alvarez says, but it's pretty consistent, which is this idea that the rate of cure or improvement was 85%. And then the remaining 15% just had neutral outcomes.
So they're self-reporting no adverse events.
That's right. And then Janine Rodilla says, after 8 years of continuous work, he succeeded in consolidating the experience gained from 764 sessions and a total patient sample of 1,023. So there's various numbers, and I don't know exactly where they're all coming from because, and it's hard to know too, like which ones were the Mexico clinic. And then, people in the U.S. said that the supposedly non-drug sessions there were thousands of people that did those. So,
I mean, there's also like a lot of this is admittedly self-reported. We also came across a dissertation that discusses some of the non-drug convivials. And like one of the things that struck me is that there were some documents in there from like participant experiences, and you can see that there's certainly the hint that like it wasn't all good or neutral. At least that was my understanding or interpretation of some of the notations in that book. And so like this notion that these self-reports are accurate. I mean, Lily came across a bunch of advertisements in really old newspapers that were sort of claiming this high, 80+% curative rate as sort of like, come see the miracle therapist, get your wonder treatment.
There's also a fantastic
seems familiar.
There's a fantastic article in Fate magazine, April 1976, called "Bad Trips, Maybe the Best Trips" by Walter Houston Clark, and it's an account of him doing one of the group sessions that I really think is worth reading.
Yeah.
Was there something?
I just had a clarification around the lineage from Maria Sabina. Was Roquette suggesting that the approach described in the podcast was related to, because it seems extremely different from what she was doing. So, like, where is the connection there?
So this
So he-
actually gets. Sorry, go ahead, Lily.
No, you go ahead.
I just want to take a note. Like this gets to the fact that like the people whose accounts we're relying on are situated within psychedelia and in relation to Roquette and some of these other characters in ways that I think make like they require us to take the things that are reported with a grain of salt. So Alexander Dawson is probably like gives the deepest dive into some of that. And yet when Dawson describes the manner in which Roquette took components of what Maria Sabina was presenting him, Dawson describes it, like acknowledges how it could be perceived as appropriation or extractivism, but then says, no, Roquette wasn't intending to appropriate it, wasn't intending to extract it. And so based on these dynamics, based on the fact that Roquette sought to engage in these ways, it doesn't count as appropriation, which I think is a rather suspect claim when you then look through. And I think it's also Dawson who reports that at the end, near the end of her life, Sabina felt quite, if not mistreated, she had real issues with the fact that Roquette took sort of her lineage, her practices, and turned them into this other thing that gained fame and fortune for him, and didn't pay it back to her in certain ways. So I think and Roquette also had these ideas where, and again, the way Dawson treats this, it raises a lot of questions, particularly like if you think about how ethnography is done more broadly, but the way Dawson situates sort of Roquette's, he presents it almost as like a reverence for the Indigenous, because rather than questioning their sort of approach as curers, he's like, okay, well, Roquette clearly accepted them as curers and then took these Indigenous practices and sort of applied them in, I think he refers to them as like Western psychotherapeutic frameworks. And so there was this sense of, this works here. And he compares it with peyotism and some of the treatments of like peyote for alcoholism or whatever, and the way that certain people who were exploring that took these plants, these drugs out of their traditional context and said, say rather than looking at the way that these facilitate certain social engagements within these contexts, they're now looking at these things as pharmaceutical or chemical sort of treatments of individualized ailments or conditions or what have you.
Just because I know that we are reaching sort of a more general audience than perhaps usual, I wanted to just mention that Maria Sabina is the reason why anybody really knows about psychedelic mushrooms in the West. She's a Mazatec curandera that really all of her encounters with the sort of representatives of the West didn't really leave her with a lot of good things to say. She died penniless as a result of sharing her knowledge with Gordon Wasson, who lied about what he was going to do. He said he was not going to reveal her location. Her life really was ruined anytime she shared her knowledge. So,
and not just penniless,
yeah.
right? There were like serious social repercussions as
well.
well.
Her son was murdered. Her house was burned down. The influx of hippies into Huautla de Jimenez, they had to declare martial law for like 3 years.
And Roquette came in towards the end of that, according to Dawson. Roquette basically came in at a point where there had already been a lot of this sort of influx of drug tourists.
Right. One other point I just want... Oh, go on.
No, go ahead.
Just like back of the envelope math of some of these self-reported individuals. Like if Roquette was practicing for 7 years, if he had 764 clients during that time, let's just say he was seeing 2 people a week, although we can imagine some group sessions, and we're really to believe that during these early experimental days, nothing went wrong?
Yeah, there's I have a thing about that. But before I get to it, uh there's just a few things I think merit a little explication. One is that he would treat patients over a long period of time, and so he would curate different trips for them and put them on different drugs at different points based on his method. It's kind of, some of it seemed like it was planned, and some of it seemed like it was sort of intuitive based or whatever. And so the same people would come back multiple times, which is why we get this like 700 and however many sessions, but 1,000 and however many patients, because he was treating the same people multiple times. There is an account that I found from Walter Houston Clark's another essay he wrote on art and psychotherapy in Mexico. And it says, any therapist is entitled to ask whether such rigorous therapy does not go too far. If it is effective in some cases, is it not destructive in others? The appearance is that Roquette can do in months what most psychotherapists take years to do, and do it better. And since he does it in groups at much lower cost, therefore he can bring the benefits of depth psychotherapy to a much larger population than others can. He has described his theories and methods in greater detail in a monograph based on a presentation in an international meeting in 1975. But his rivals have begun to lose patience to him several years ago. They claim that hospitals, quote, were full of Dr. Roquette's mistakes. On these serious charges, he was arrested and jailed. In Mexico, an accused person is deemed guilty until he can prove himself innocent. I am told that if even one of these, quote, mistakes could have been produced at the trial, he would still be in prison. But after 5 months, he was released from jail, completely exonerated. Yet since his enemies still have ways to harass him, he has hesitated to reopen his institute until the Mexican Department of Health gives him specific permission.
And what year was that written in?
1977.
So that's the next year after Clark's first piece, or that previous piece.
So he was a victim of his own success, and the other doctors resented him. Surely there were no mistakes coming about from putting people on drugs and inundating them. The other thing that I just I've read a lot about with a lot of concern given my own lived experience, but he was using datura on people. And the way that he would use it, as I understand it, is that like later in their process, when they'd done a bunch of other drugs, so after months or a year of treatment, he would administer the datura to them, and then that would produce a prolonged and very intense suffering. So they would be in real acute distress and anxious, sometimes for up to a month. So he was like putting people into that sort of a state, leaving them there as long as he thought they could take it, and then giving them a big fat ketamine adventure. And this is something that Lehrman talks about in his talk that's on YouTube, which is this idea of, really bringing people to these very intense hellscapes. You're in a personal hell that this guy has created with all this sensory overload. You're on drugs. It's super intense. And after hours of this kind of stuff, then they start injecting you with ketamine repeatedly. So you spend a couple of hours out in like a K-hole. And what was seen as the therapeutic value of this was to go from this intense experience of suffering and neuroses to this like expansive kind of like nothing is anything and everything is fine. And here I am floating across the universe place, which I think is really odd. And I think the Walter Houston Clark piece on bad trips or the best trips it's a really clear and vivid example where he talks about there were moments where because when Roquette would do the sessions, he and his assistants would be in white. They were very into like the theater of it. So they were wearing white coats on the side of the room and taking notes, and very like distant from the people who were like tripping out and losing their mind. And so there's this feeling of sometimes they're like demons and they're making this is horrible. This is the Inquisition. And then they're the most compassionate, patient angel people who are helping me when I'm like writhing on the floor screaming. Like, so this pivoting from demon to angel, from hell to heaven, like there's this arc here as far as like creating intense suffering for people and then not just alleviating that suffering, but inducing these intense bliss states where you who've actually been doing this really intense stuff to them are now the savior, is like I find that arc of the journey to be very disturbing and distressing to think about, and also easy to see why, like, I think if I went through an experience like that, I too might be like, yeah, that was, I'm with it now. Like I can take anything, and I've like, it's just, it's like, it's really, but I don't think it's ethical, and I don't think that this is one of those many contexts where it's like, I actually don't think that subjective self-reports are sufficient to actually getting at what is the long-term consequences and impacts and effects of a treatment like this, because these are suggestibility enhancing drugs. People are being told that this is helpful for them. This is the sort of thing where I think you need a series of external measures that are not reliant on self-reports if you really want to understand what the fuck is going on.
Well, and also,
Yeah, I mean,
when
were there
you're-
like long-term follow-ups for any of this? Because I'm thinking like if it was all self-reported directly after these experiences, like anyone who's had an intense psychedelic trip, like, is pretty thankful when it starts coming down and you realize like, wow, I'm grounded again. Like like I really can take on the world. Like that wasn't forever. Like that's like
good
a
to
big
be alive.
deal depending on when you took those reports.
Yeah, this is
Totally.
actually something that Whitney found in this PhD thesis that was written about the Roquette convivials. Was he actually like painstakingly was reading through the like the notes, like the handwritten notes that the participants in some of this had written down, and was saying that, like, by his assessment, and if Whitney ever hear this and I'm incorrect in summarizing this, do let me know. But my understanding of his assessment of that was that some people's self-reports seemed to be engaged in a kind of benefit finding that wasn't necessarily based on like clear, obvious, tangible benefit.
and
What-
I mean,
what
some of the
everything you're
questioning
saying
was written
here-
down. Sorry,
Everything
go
that
ahead.
you've been saying for the last couple of minutes, the word that's been bouncing around my head, or the phrase, is trauma bonding, in the sense that people going through these experiences, like, it's hellish, it's awful, it's the highest heights, it's the deepest lows, and then you come out and you're okay, and this person, or you think you're okay, and this person who's in authority, you're going to sing their praises, perhaps more often than not. But hospitals full of mishaps is not exactly great either.
Yeah, and I think as well, like when your supposed therapy functionally doubles as torture, when the same components are present, that should be raising, I think, significant questions. And I'm really grateful for the treatment of some of Roquette's stuff by a Mexican scholar named David Pavon Cuyar, who wrote a great paper that we'll also have in the additional reading section for the episode, that translates to Psychology and Destruction of the Psyche, the Professional Use of Psychological Knowledge for Torture of Political Prisoners. And I know we want to talk a little bit about other aspects of the episode and all of that, but like one of the things that I found really interesting in reading Cuyar's article is that it gets into some of the histories and the connections with the DFS, the Mexican secret police. So according to Cuyar, Roquette was working directly under Miguel Nazar Haro, who was the head of the DFS, who was running campaigns against a number of dissidents, was also tied up in narco trafficking, and there's like a whole bunch of stuff there. But like Nazar Haro sort of falls into this role of almost this stereotypical like CIA asset, like including the fact that at one point there's a book on him called Our Man in Mexico. And he gets busted by the FBI for his role in this car theft ring. And the FBI is interested in prosecuting him or whatever. And the CIA is like, nope, he's too valuable to us. You are absolutely not going to prosecute him. We're going to just keep using him. And I believe he was also a contact for certain FBI operations as well. And then when you look at the role that so when Roquette tortured Federico Emery Ulloa, who was a Maoist student dissident, I think this was in '68, and you like when you read the setup around this and the fact that like Roquette subjected him to various psychedelics, to playing different films, you know, porn, movies of like war scenes, violence, loud music, Wagner, whatever. You know, a whole bunch of different. Sorry,
Wagner?
a whole bunch of different things. Yeah, my fault. My and the fact that this is like 1-for-1 or 1-to-1 to like the therapy, right? Like that this is functionally what is being sold as a psychotherapeutic intervention, which, as Russ pointed out, when you're talking about a novel psychotherapeutic intervention with incredibly high curative rates that can be scaled in ways that will offer all sorts of cost saving and great benefits to society as you reduce the level of social unrest and create better citizens, like it sounds awfully similar to some of the messaging we're hearing around the current psychedelic renaissance, and throw in the notion that like there aren't bad trips, there are just challenging
I was just going to ask you
experiences.
this, Dave. Like, so that the origin of there's no bad trips, it's only challenging experiences. That goes back to Roquette.
Sometimes
Sure
the best
seems that
trips
way
are
to me.
the bad trips.
I mean, well, when you look at the Walter Houston Clark, bad trips may be the best trips from
Yeah.
1976, however long ago that is. That's a long
I mean,
time
he may
ago.
not have been the only person to like develop out that concept, but there does seem to be a thread there as far as normalizing the idea.
Yeah, I mean, I can see a lot of people idolizing Roquette, students, and whatnot, sort of taking that forward, spreading the bad word.
I think, yeah, one of the things we really wanted to draw attention to in this work is the way that lineage functions, the way that ideas and techniques are passed on and normalized over time. And so, part of it was trying to understand how Roquette's techniques and the authoritarian ideology underpinning them was transmitted over time. And then there's this piece around like, well, what was going on as far as dual relationships and potentially sexualized relationships with students and with clients. And so that was kind of also where we were looking into some of the stuff around Pablo Sanchez. And people talked about that I talked to about Sanchez, who knew him well, talked about, it was a much gentler way of practicing, and it was this other thing that got sort of passed on and transmuted. And then we were trying to also understand the relationship that Francoise Borzat had
Can
with
you?
Sanchez.
Who is Pablo Sanchez?
So Pablo Sanchez was as I understand it, a social worker in the Bay Area who was doing Roquette style sessions through the 1980s. And so it's like until very recently, the content of his sessions felt a bit like a black box, because unlike Roquette, where there's quite a lot written about him, there's not very much written about Sanchez. But I've spoken to different people now who witnessed Sanchez engage in boundary crossing, behaviors and, um, inappropriate touch with women. And then there was the question of his relationship to Francoise. Now, the reason that mattered, because, the reason that I thought that really mattered was because, it has to do with normalizing sexual and romantic relationships between a teacher / therapist and client / students. And it seems to have been a question for me of, if this is indeed a behavior that Francoise is carrying forward in her work, as alleged by the lawsuit that we talk about in Power Trip, where did some of those behaviors come from, or where else have they been normalized? And then to see that there may indeed be a kind of direct through line, that seemed that it's the normalization piece. That was why that mattered to me to explore and to try to understand.
And there was multiple people that you spoke to who say that Francoise meant that Pablo Sanchez, her mentor, was having some sexual contact with the women in sessions.
Yeah, and it seems like it was also but I've heard stories about things that occurred in sessions. I've also heard stories about things that sort of suggest that it was more of a community, and people were, they didn't just see each other in sessions, they knew each other in different settings and different
Sure,
contexts.
those lines are
And
completely blurred. Those boundaries
Well,
really
and that
didn't
goes
exist.
into the question, the dual relationship issues. Sorry, Lily.
yeah, well, and that I think is, and this is more, I want to say this with like a grain of salt, but I think one of the, there's a really strong narrative around blending Western psychotherapy with Indigenous and also Eastern exotic traditions. And I think part of what that allows for is this idea that, in the village, in the Indigenous context, these standard rules do not apply. People can, you take somebody in who's in a place of need, or you give them the shirt off your back, or this very romantic and idealized understanding of the ways in which folks in Indigenous contexts care for each other, and then trying to apply those in an American, California context, where those ideas don't always translate and may be directly at odds with the established professional norms of patient therapist or doctor relationship.
And in
Yeah,
many
especially
cases,
in.
sorry, go
No,
ahead.
sorry,
Luis.
go on, Dave. Well, I was just gonna say it's an issue, especially in like an American psychedelic scene context too, where there's a lot of practitioners who are kind of trying to take a professional role as a healer and a professional like therapy role, and but these subcultures are also kind of enmeshed in scenes that are kind of centered around not partying always, but like these scenes and vibes of like a psychedelic scene, like, and socializing in these scenes. Like I could see how it's especially easy for the not justifying any of these boundaries being crossed, but that like when you're participating in these underground scenarios that kind of enmesh with social scenes, I could just see how some of these relationship boundaries get crossed very easily.
So, some of it's the nature of prohibition. When your
Mhm.
supplier is your party host and or therapist, things get muddy very quickly.
For sure.
Yeah, and also there's
and
some kind of celebrity that goes along with being like a psychedelic therapist or a psychedelic like,
Absolutely.
person. When you go to event gatherings, people go around you. You kind of get high off that a little bit. I've seen it happen.
So there's two
at
things.
various after parties, conferences. Like I've seen
Yep.
Burning Man. Like that exists.
So that dynamic, but also like, so there's this issue going back to some of the Indigenous projections, right? There's this collapsing. There's this like creation of this Indigenous monolith where it's like, oh, well, in an Indigenous context, it would be like this, or the Indigenous perspective on this is fill in the blank. And it's like the way that these treatments, these projections of indigeneity fundamentally collapse diverse and varied cultures and don't actually meet them on their own terms, don't attempt to engage with their cosmologies or world building or meaning making on their own terms, and instead create this projection. Like, I think this is something that is really important to consider when we talk about lineage, particularly when we talk about the consciousness medicine lineage that attempts to claim a certain proximity to indigeneity through a lineage that doesn't really it traces back to Sabina through Roquette's engagement with Sabina, not through Sabina herself. And like when you then look at these questions of whether it's Dawson's treatment of the appropriation or it's Roquette's projections of how indigenous healing fits. And right, when we say indigenous healing, we're talking about the Mazatec in this context, right? How Mazatec healing fits in a so-called Western psychotherapeutic model, never mind that his approach to Western psychotherapy resulted in torture, right? And then, and similar, like this point that Normie made about the power trip of being the person to give that experience, right? Part of the reason, one of my earliest strongest rejections of practitioners came as a result of seeing people who were dispensing drugs and then saying, I'm the person giving you that experience. And it's like, fundamentally, no, you cannot get between a person and their receptors. You are giving them the substance. You may have access to the supply chain. You may, you may even be the person extracting or synthesizing or whatever. But at the end of the day, that experience, like, it's not your experience to give. Like this is, and this comes down to some of my opposition to commodification.
Yeah. Why is it always the middlemen? What? Get out of here, you know?
All right, so
which ties into the, just real quick, it ties into the Walter Houston Clark thing as well, right? The notion that the person giving you or facilitating the experience can be as readily a devil as an angel, and just thinking about the degree of power and authority that can be claimed around that. And then if we look at decades of abuses, of cover-ups, of transgressions, like this is a real and ongoing problem.
So do you guys want to do a look at the Center for Consciousness Medicine Lineage?
Yeah, let's do it.
Kind of the lineage chart, whatever you want to call it. Do you want
So
to take
it's
a look
worth
at that?
saying,
And also,
yeah, Normie, while you pull that up, I just want to point out that this was one of the first things that disappeared off the site.
I was just
after
going to point that out. It's no longer on the site, correct?
Which is super
We'll throw those
interesting
up in
because
the-
it was very much what they led with in terms of their own authority.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, Dave, your point about how Roquette's connection to Sabina is already a little shaky, and then consciousness medicine saying it's got this indigenous lineage, and then like the result of all of this is Francoise ending up on panels where she's representing indigenous perspectives, and it's just interesting how that all plays out.
And to be fair, I don't want to invisibilize like Francois' relationship with Julieta Casimira.
Sure.
Right. But also if we look at the Sabina lineage, so this goes back to I think Lily's points about some of the romanticization of some of these people, like Maria Sabina's grandson. I'm spacing on his actual name at the moment, but he was an enforcer for a cartel, went by the name El Diablo, killed a former school teacher, had connections to like this PRI connected cartel. We'll throw an article of that in the readings section. Hey y'all, this is Editor Dave chiming in from the future, and the reason that you're hearing from me is because I ironically and quite unfortunately butchered some of my discussion of the lineage of some of the characters involved in and around Huatla. So it felt important to set the record straight, and rather than trying to just riff on it once again, I'm going to go ahead and read a brief excerpt from Ben Feinberg's ethnography, Undiscovering the Pueblo Mágico, Lessons from Huatla for the Psychedelic Renaissance. So this passage deals with Julieta Casimiro. The bio for Julieta on the 13 Grandmothers website demonstrates the way her image circulates globally. She is totally removed from her local social, cultural, and political context through generic imagery of commodified indigenousness and generic native wisdom about protecting the environment. An always already hybridized curing tradition is described as ancient and pre-Hispanic. Cosmopolitan Huatla is misrepresented as a village, and Julieta's economic activities are mystified as a benevolent organization of village women. In fact, Julieta and her family are powerful figures in a complex local and regional politics, closely tied to the PRI, the formerly dominant political party. In 2004, her son, known as El Diablo, was photographed beating a retired teacher to death because he was involved in a political protest against the gubernatorial candidate. El Diablo was never arrested and is still politically active, and a frequent presence in Julieta's household, along with her cosmopolitan clients. She has been able to creatively translate each of the themes of outsider discourse, mushroom use as the preserved past, the cure as female, and the lack of interest in actual Mazatec life, into a long and successful career. I don't know if it's better or worse than pronouncing Wagner as Wagner, but hey, this was a doozy for me, so thanks for sticking around. But like when you look at some of the things going down around Huatla and other localities, you know, like people are people that have like complex social relationships and relations to power, authority, organized crime, governments. Like there are just, you know, the notion that like saying I'm close to this indigenous lineage is a meaningful statement in and of itself. Like I think you really got to dig deeper and see what are the dynamics at hand, what's going on here.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share this.
Awesome.
So you guys can tell me when to move around.
Yeah, I mean,
So-
What are we looking at here?
So
Yeah.
because it's quite far away. If you look, the black and white photos at the top, on the far left is Maria Sabina, in the middle is Salvador Roquet, and then to the right of that is Pablo Sanchez. And so there's a direct line from both Sanchez and Roquet to Aharon and Francoise, who were there at the edge. They both also claim connection to Ralph Metzner. And then that's at the very bottom, Eugenia, and to the left of her, Doña Julieta. And I'm not sure what the far left on the bottom is. But so they're claiming this kind of indirect connection to Sabina as a Mazatec lineage carrier at the top, and then more directly and more recently Julieta and Eugenia down the bottom.
And they just, you know, so they have bios of.
Yeah, so if you clicked on the little circles at the top, it would walk you through the bio and say a little bit about the lineage or the connection between the different characters and players.
Sure. People are interested in reading these, they can pause if you're watching
Or they
the video.
can check out, we'll have these up in the additional reading section on the symposia.com/power trip.
Yeah, I also just Dave and I had put together a coggle once that is an interesting exercise, and we had done some of the maths just based on some of the books and readings we'd done. So it looks like Aharon Grossbard met Sanchez around 1983, and then Francoise met Aharon around 1985. And Grossbard introduced Borzat to Sanchez in 1985, and then Borzat soon assisted Sanchez and did some Roquette convivials a little after that. So, yeah, this was all kind of starting in the mid-'80s.
I just want to say I'm so sick of the word convivial at this point. Like, I've heard it so many times. I don't like it.
Well, you stuck with it, sweetheart.
So we've seen the lineage, and the lineage is very much part of the rhetoric of this institution, and yet it was the first to go.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and there's a
Well,
thing too. I mean, if you read through, so like there's a number of, and I won't get too deeply into this because we're going to come back to it, but there's a number of graduate or of students of Grossbard who have put him in their acknowledgments of their dissertation or dissertations. There are also people who have made various public statements. So it's like the kind of thing where it's like, I think for a significant period of time, there's been a sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge attitude with regards to these folks signaling to each other and folks in the know what they're connected to and who they're connected to. And unfortunately, for a lot of these folks, that's now traceable. You can go pull those
a
dissertations.
liability.
You can pull those interviews. You can find out who knows who connects themselves back to Grossbard and Borzot. And I think part of the reason that this winked out so quickly is because they recognized that this is a liability, or at least that's my suspicion. And I think it's one of the things that Lily and I have done throughout this, going back to the very beginning when we put together a coggle, a sort of mind map of all of the different people with all of the connections, is that there are a lot of people who have, to my mind, no plausible deniability for what's happened. There are so many people who have been in proximity, who have been aware of some of the goings on in and around these communities that, like...
Hang on, so I'm just going to play devil's advocate for a moment, and it sounds like y'all are just playing this game of guilt by association here. What do you say to that?
Yeah,
think-
so go ahead, you go.
I mean, yeah. First of all, Dr. Pace, I do believe the devil has enough advocates. Thank you very much. But to answer your question, the problem isn't the specific people. The problem is the ideologies underpinning their practice. The problem is authoritarianism, and it's not isolated to this lineage. It's not isolated to this particular cluster. I think this cluster provides a very, very clear example of the techniques and the logic and theory underpinning it. But I think once you understand that, you can't unsee it, and you can start to see how this kind of authoritarian power tripping approach to psychedelic work is very pervasive and widespread across.
I think that's
psychedelic
a
spaces.
difficult thing for a lot of people to understand, because sort of this Roquette light, I don't like this kind of modality of therapy. It's really spread throughout this space. It's very normalized right now, and I think a lot of people just can't see it at all.
I
And
think
they
that
think that this
I
is
think they'll
normal.
start to.
Sure.
I think that
Kill your
I
ego,
hope-
break you down, build you back up.
Bad trips are good trips.
Yeah.
I've heard this for, the last handful of years that I've been involved in this space. I've challenged people about it. I think I thought it was ridiculous we did an event with someone back in 2016, 2017. I thought it was ridiculous then. I don't understand. I just don't get it. I don't get how it's been so normalized.
Well, and I think there's a lack of, like, not only is there a general permissibility around sort of, and I think Lily mentioned it in the episode, this notion that, like, oh, psychedelic therapy is such a radical new healing modality, we can throw out the rule book. And I think it's something we see frequently from people in the space who seem to pretend as if there are not pre-existing ethical norms. Like, we need to create new ethical norms
This comes
for
from
psychedelic therapy.
and this comes from
It's
like the highest institutions and people as well. That, I mean, I just saw another one. I just saw another email the other day, and it's like, what? Like,
But so one of the things that I found really helpful through this whole process is requesting, when people tell you that they're doing certain things, particularly things that may raise red flags for you, is to ask them what their clinical rationale is for doing that, and to ask them to explain, to give you the underlying reasons, to walk you through why they're doing what they're doing. And if they can't, or if those reasons,
their answer is intuition.
like, these are things that should be challenged. People can't just say, oh, I'm the healer, you ought to trust me. And this is another moment why, and it's part of the reason why I think that the sort of authoritarian, anti-authoritarian framework is particularly useful, not only because we're talking about healing, we're talking about like situations in which, like, somebody's knowledge of themselves, I think, should be understood to be probably of the utmost importance. But then beyond that, if somebody is going to posit a reason why that should be disregarded for whatever reason, they should be able to give some sound rationalization, justification. And if they can't, then I would suggest that approach is fundamentally invalid.
Yeah.
I also just want to jump in and say, like, maybe some people are really into this, and I think that there is something to be said for how it gets framed. So there's a big difference between calling something psychiatry or psychotherapy or a healing modality versus calling something a kink. Like if you want to frame this as a dom sub,
Mind
or like a
fuck.
mind fuck scenario of like I want to sign over my autonomy to this other person who's going to put me through hell, and it's going to be terrifying and intense, but I am giving informed consent to the best of my ability. I understand very thoroughly there are very significant risks involved. This isn't therapy, this isn't medicine, this isn't supposed to heal me. I would like an extreme experience that's sort of like a mental version of extreme sports. Like, I'm not trying to get in the way of people doing the things that they want to do. You
You're not
know,
trying to
like,
yuck people's yum.
yeah, no, like if that's their kink, that's their kink. My issue is when it becomes framed as a healing modality targeting vulnerable people and telling them that if they do this thing, they're not going to suffer as much anymore.
Mhm.
Like I can't stress enough that when you are telling people on the other side of submitting to this or going through this or dealing with this immediate pain and suffering, you're going to feel connected and you're going to feel belonging and you're going to feel healed and whole, and you're going to have relief from this pain that you've been carrying around since you were a child or since you were whenever. Like, that's coercive, in the same way that, like, if we're talking about a kink context, it's one thing for a person to say, I know the ways in which I want to engage in this activity on the basis of my desires as for example, like as a masochist, versus if person who's not into kink ends up falling in love with a person who has sadistic tendencies and then is emotionally coerced to satisfy that person's sadistic urges because they love and care for that person and are therefore starting to consent to things that they otherwise would never seek out on their own.
Right.
Like I don't mean to like rabbit hole on a different thing, and I'm not really a
No,
kink
I
expert,
actually think
but
it's really.
I don't
I'm not a
think
kink expert either, but I like what you're doing. First of all, because we've already had these criticisms when we went and dug into the Martin Ball world. And a lot of people said that we were just like trying to limit people's freedom to consent to weird stuff that we just were, we were yucking people's yums basically. But even in the BDSM community, there is a mantra. And the BDSM community has its own things, but it's safe, sane, consensual. Okay. So in the BDSM community, it's generally not a good idea to cut somebody's arm off, regardless of whether somebody says that that's what they want. Right. That crosses the boundary of sane and safe. Right.
Well,
Anyhow, I just wanted to
yeah.
acknowledge this is a good point, and it's one that has been tossed at us. People can consent to extreme experiences. They can consent to being like psychically and even physically vulnerable for a period of time. But I don't think that that's really our concern here.
No, and I want to point out, in the case of Ball, it felt like many of the people who were making those arguments were intentionally avoiding the fact that Ball himself had admitted to doing things to non-responsive clients of his, right? That like Ball admitted on camera to engaging in behavior that I understand qualifies as sexual assault, and I think that like being clear about that as like this very much isn't an issue of people's kinks. And Nishay has also made a number of points that I think I hope not to put you on the spot, but like you had made some points about like consent and where those edges are, and talking about things like DBT. And well, I'll just shut up and let you go.
Yeah, well, it sort of relates to something I was going to say, maybe not exactly, but I just wanted to point to this article that I've brought up a bunch in our like off recording conversations. It's an article that's called What I Got Wrong in More Than Two, The Dark Night of the Soul, on a website or blog called Brighter Than Sunflowers. And More Than Two is a book about polyamory, and it's written by someone who basically advocated for an overlapping ideology when it came to polyamory, but then heard about the Nexium Fright experiments, which bear a lot of similarities to Roquette's method, and then had this wake up call of how this approach to thinking about suffering and inflicting pain on people opens the door for abuse. And so I'm just going to read a few sentences from it because I think it really speaks to what's going on here. So she says, pain is a signal. Sometimes, very often, in fact, it's a signal that you're being hurt and need to stop what you're doing. My advice in More Than Two, that book that she had written, led me to endure years of abuse without ever realizing what was happening to me, because I believed that if my relationship hurt, it was because I was unlearning conditioning or needed to fix something in myself or just get through it. The problem is that the social and psychological milieu that is reinforced by the popular poly literature that she was contributing to deadens our ability to tell the difference between these kinds of pain, between the psychic equivalent of a nice deep stretch and the pop of a tendon tearing or shoulder dislocating. All pain is the same from this perspective. All pain must be embraced and worked through. And then she ends with this point that I want to get to. And then when someone is abusive, when someone genuinely wants to undermine your ability to trust yourself, to believe in yourself, to say ouch and stop, when someone is genuinely more invested in getting what they want from you and others than they are in mutual co-creation of well-being, then we've just handed them the weapons they need.
Amazing.
And I want to point out too, like we've brought up some of the, how these techniques have been used elsewhere, and I want to point to Naomi Klein's shock doctrine and her points about how the most sort of actionable and sort of well employed ongoingly techniques that came out of MK Ultra are precisely those that get used at CIA black sites to torture people.
Right.
I was going to say before, like when I think of Roquette's techniques, 3 things pop into mind: Ewan Cameron McGill, Clockwork Orange, CIA black sites. Like those are the 3
Guantanamo Bay.
Yep.
Those are the 3 general areas that I tend to think of, and Roquette has elements of each of them.
I would consider what Roquette was doing as MK Ultra adjacent, in the absence of evidence that he was somehow trained by the multinational network that actually implemented MK Ultra. I guess it was MK. I think it was MK Delta that was. Or am I confusing that with MK Naomi? There was a specific separate designation for that, which was international. Anyhow, Nishay, that quote really put something on the table that brings up something from the physiological literature for me, which is that there is and the nuance in that, which is that there's a difference between that which is distress and that which is eustress. So distress is like, you're breaking things. But in the biosphere project, if anybody knows about this, like trees started falling over randomly because in the biosphere there was no wind. And wind is eustress. Eustress is when we rip our muscle fibers lifting weights. That's cellular damage, but it causes a kind of strengthening as a response. So we need to have nuance when we talk about challenging experiences, particularly when we're beating the drum of the bad trips or the best trips.
Yeah, and this comes back to Nishay's points, and I'm curious if you're okay with it, if I can put you on the spot a little bit, Nishay, around some of how DBT deals with resistance and the fact that like this isn't like what we are not here saying like there's no need for people to like sit with their discomfort or work through that or like engage with that in productive ways. I think these are more questions about like what that looks like, where that comes from, who is in charge, how does consent work? And I'm curious because you've brought up the DBT thing a few times, and I'd just like to, if you could give us some perspective on that, I think that'd be cool.
Yeah, and just as a caveat, I'm no expert in DBT, but I'm interested in it and just had been reading about it, and so I know. So DBT is dialectical behavioral therapy, and it was originally developed specifically to address or to help people with borderline personality disorder, which is notoriously difficult to treat according to like conventional approaches to therapy, partially because a lot of the kind of tactics that people develop to cope with, in often case like trauma in their previous kind of upbringing, end up with causing resistances to therapy. So you might suspect, for example, that your therapist is out to get you when they're not, because you are conditioned to assume that people are out to get you. Might misread someone looking away as being, oh, they're secretly like, you know, not interested in your well-being, you know, things like that, that will cause you to then whatever your therapist suggests that you do, you're not going to do that because you've just kind of become convinced that this person's out to harm you. So there are these real resistances to therapy that are associated with things like borderline, that there are therapeutic methods that have been developed to work in cases where people will resist and don't want to go along with everything that's being proposed. But there's a nuance, there's a big difference between, because it's like with DBT and other approaches, like even family systems therapy, where you're working with like the idea of like different parts of a person that have different ideas about what should happen. The idea is to get consent from the different parts and to see a resistance not as an opportunity to bulldoze and kind of like force a solution based on what you think is right, but as an opportunity to negotiate and navigate, where is this coming from? How can we help the person come to a perspective on the resistance such that it doesn't pose the same kind of resistance as it does when it first goes up? But so I think like there's this kernel of truth that sometimes resistance happens to the things that will kind of like help you, and that you don't want to just like stop there. But that kernel of truth has been corrupted such that any resistance is being framed as this person needs me to bulldoze based on what I, in my all-knowing kind of grandeur, in the case of people who are more narcissistic, assume is right in the moment. And I think there's a lot to be learned by how the evidence-based approaches to dealing with the resistance work out, and in terms of outcomes and in terms of patient well-being and safety, and contrast it with because it's that kernel of truth that's being used to justify harming people right now.
And you said something at the end, I think your point about evidence-based, like there's already been some, I think, interesting, certainly rather engaging back and forths on Twitter discussion about like these tensions, precisely the ones you just highlighted. And when people are saying, well, so what methods do we, if like, what are we okay with? What can we just throw out? Is it okay to throw out things that, can we throw out torture? And like, I think there's a real question of like, if we're talking about the notion of therapies, particularly if we're talking about therapies with highly vulnerable populations, my baseline as admittedly a non-clinician, non-therapist, non-anything, like the notion that we wouldn't start from a place of like, well, let's look at like evidence-based practice, like, and what is the clinical rationale for the things that are going on? Like that seems like an easy starting point. Like that, it doesn't seem to me like it should be difficult to win people over to that. And like if people want to push for maverick or rogue or radical therapies, they should be able to provide a clinical rationale. If not, like if they want to say this is so nascent, we don't have an evidence base, then you should be able to lay out the conceptual framework for then doing the sort of studies, research, what have you, that would give you an evidence base to then advance your therapy. And if you're opposed to that, why? Where is that resistance coming from?
Well, but we are at this place right now in the discussion of psychedelics and psychedelic therapy, where we're talking numbers of therapists that will be trained on specific timelines to scale up, and not just from one institution, but from multiple competing institutions. And because of the nature of what we're talking about in this particular commentary episode of Power Trip really does get to MK Ultra adjacent material, there's a point that like I've been sort of scratching my head over for a while, and pointed to occasionally, which is that there's really a lack of reckoning with the legacy of MK Ultra. Naomi Klein, accepted, and it's her analysis to bring it to Guantanamo is great, and yet the institutional control over psychedelics, over patients, over wards of the state, that was a blank check for like 30 years, and the evidence was destroyed. I do believe that now is the time for more scholarship on this, and that it's really necessary for us to engage with these dark legacies if we are to forge a path forward that fits what human needs and tolerances actually look like. We have to look at what harm has been done if we want to do good. What are the parameters?
I think we also have to look at like the ways in which good gets distorted. And what I mean by that is like Nishay talking about how, this other way in which like sitting with discomfort and working with resistance can then be distorted in service to this very different way of practice. And it's one of the things that like frustrates me about um some of these sorts of practices in like these sorts of groups and high control groups more broadly is that they'll take ideas that sort of sound right, or they'll use languaging that kind of feels good, but it's not kind of hard to figure out exactly what it means. Or, they put people in states where things, there is something that feels good happening, or they'll take a kernel of something that's kind of wise and insightful and then twist it and distort it. And um, one of the things I often think about is like this stuff, of course, it's not all bad. The issue that comes to bear is that good qualities are used for nefarious ends. Good things are used to draw people in. It's like when people talk about, in the context of gender-based violence, abusive relationships, it's like, somebody who goes on to engage in abuse, they don't start with the most vile thing they've got up their sleeve. Like it's gradual and incremental, and usually they're very charming and charismatic at the start, and even down the line they have their charming, charismatic, lovely, wonderful moments where everything feels good and okay. And like if that weren't in the picture, like people wouldn't stick around, people wouldn't get drawn in. Like we have to realize that there are like very alluring, attractive, sometimes, at least temporarily beneficial things that are happening here, that, for example, people may for a while feel a real sense of belonging, or they may feel like, oh, that first journey, like that, I had a lot of relief from that. And that's real, and that may count for something. But it's on a path towards what might be an incursion into their autonomy and their agency and their well-being, that's done precisely by taking the things that are working and using that as manipulation.
I think
Cults love to love bomb.
I think that's Susan's trajectory until she came to the understanding that this is fucked up.
But this is one of the things that I think is so. Like, this is one of the, I think, ongoing failings of the psychedelic community, quote unquote, right? Like the fact that there is not more vigilance and willingness to engage with this kind of behavior, or the murmurings or the whisperings. Like, for example, we referenced the court case. We referenced a court case in episode 4, where we got our hands on that as Symposia. We looked through this. Like I've had people online who've said, well, look, it's all well and good to like take issue with Borzot and Grossbard now that these allegations have come forward recently. It's like there have been allegations on the record accessible to the community for decades. And the fact that there has been this meteoric rise of Borzot and that nobody did, like when we got the court case and we had a group call, reading through it, and I just like the level of horror when we read the allegations. And I want to say, Borzot has denied all the allegations in the lawsuit, which is like 40 pages, highly detailed, the kind of things that, it boggles the mind to imagine, at least for me, fabricating that much stuff and the type of stuff that's in there. But like taking that content and juxtaposing it with some of the public statements that Borzot and her acolytes have made about sexual touching, about sexual healing, about what sort of behaviors and ethical norms they find acceptable or promote. I mean, we're going to do, I think, a future power tripping delving into some of those public statements. But I just want to say that, like, we as Symposia catch a fair bit of flack for wading into and trying to amplify conversations around some of these issues. And I frankly, like, I don't think it's our responsibility. I think like if people want to make that sort of aspect of Symposia go away, they would have these conversations publicly and visibly and amongst the communities that they're a part of, because it isn't our responsibility as Symposia. It is our responsibility as communities of people who are interested in psychedelics, interested perhaps in psychedelic therapy or whatever these experiences might be. Like there is a shared burden to engage with this stuff. And the fact that there has been a lack of engagement, to my mind, is fundamentally inexcusable.
I just want to point out something in Will Hall's account. He does say that he gardened, he mowed the lawn, he hung out at the house, and then when you look at the lawsuit from 20 years ago. Oh,
yeah.
Also did some gardening. Also hung out here. So there's similarities. I mean, total similarities there. But
that's one of the things.
Point that out.
And that caught Lily and I early on, like the number of similarities between accounts. Sorry, Lily.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some of this blows my mind sometimes. It's like, why do we have to explain this? Why do we have to go through this level of like looking through the fucking documents? Just reading this, I don't know. It's so apparent. It's so obvious. It's so common sense that these practices are fucked up. And yet it's like this. It's like the core belief. It's a core modality.
Listen to Borzot talk about chaos music on the Tim Ferriss interview. Like, listen to that, knowing full well. Like listen to that. Read about Roquette. Listen to what gets said, like, and draw your own conclusion. Like,
people,
there
are like super.
I want to have some
people
sympathy.
who want to give psychedelics to other people and get. I know, but
I want to have some
power
sympathy
out of it.
In that okay, these are people who have really tried to raise their profile, to put themselves center stage, to be the champions of psychedelics, right? And the prohibition has made frank,
I don't know if that's exactly
evidence-based.
True. I don't know if they want to be champions of psychedelics, but if you want to go ahead with that assumption. In a sort of network, if you lived in the same city as Francoise Borzot and Aharon, and you traveled in certain circles, they would not be, we have to think about a temporal kind of view where this story starts in the 80s, at least with these individuals and this group of people. So it was a very, very hush-hush kind of thing. And yet these people were very much central to any inroad into these experiences. And so, I just want to point back to what Lily was saying earlier, in the sense that, like, these people were a beacon of hope for a lot of desperate people. Whether or not they delivered, I think, is highly in dispute.
Yeah, I want to jump in too, because, like, I relate to this notion of like, why do we even have to explain this? But I think I
Yes.
want to be clear as to who I feel exasperated towards, and that's
Thank
like
you.
the insiders in the psychedelic community who have known about harms for a really long time. The number of people I've talked to, on background in this project, where it's like they've known something was amiss for decades and had feelings about it, but we're not willing to go on the record, or we're not willing to take a stand, and like weren't even like really ready to speak out in any way, when it was like, but if they had done so, they might have stopped people from being harmed. And they framed their silence as the moral high ground because
Mm-hmm.
they were having a larger perspective than me and my fixation on the harm that's being done. I think that like that's I'm exasperated with insiders in the know who have enabled this. I
Sure.
am not
There-
exasperated with the many people who have been sucked in and spit back out. The people who have been
100%.
hurt, some of the people who have been hurt and sucked in and are still on the inside, because I see myself in those people. I think those people are so relatable. They're just like any of us. It's just that maybe they were at that moment in their life where someone had died, or a relationship had ended, or they lost a child, or there was an accident or something where they couldn't continue on the path they were on, and they needed help, and they got drawn in, and they got a mixed bag out of the whole thing, and they've trauma bonded, and they're still stuck on the inside. Like, my heart goes out to those people, and some of those people are a little bit in the enabler camp and a little bit in the like these aren't clearly delineated lines. But I also want to be clear that like in putting Power Trip together, I personally had two audiences in mind. One was the people who have been hurt or who are being hurt now, who are looking for some kind of understanding of what has happened, what might have happened, how do I put the pieces together to offer them food for thought, because they will make sense of those experiences in the ways that make sense to them. And we're going to hear more about that in episode 5 next week. And the other audience is outside the ever echoing psychedelic chaos chamber that is the contemporary psychedelic renaissance. Because if we're talking about mainstreaming and we're talking about scaling these things up, there are a bunch of psychedelic naive people out there that don't know what's normal and don't know what to expect, who need to understand that this is what's gone on the inside, so that they can make better decisions for themselves and have information, and we can do harm reduction. And also, I think the psychedelic community has shown over time it is incapable of regulating itself. And if it can't do that, and if it wants to normalize its thing and make it all mainstream, then the people on the outside need to be aware. They have to be aware.
And
that's
That was an epic
Preach,
epic
preach.
epic tear, Lily. And thank you for clarifying that too. My frustration, I didn't clarify, but my frustration is really like squarely targeted on insiders who think that this fucking shit is acceptable.
let's be clear, there are people involved in the Oregon 109 movement who are who are aware of allegations against Borzot, who chose not to speak up, who chose to speak up and tell other people who then chose not to speak up, right? Like there was a lack of willingness. There was concern about damaging that movement to advance what? Some sort of psilocybin services, pseudo therapeutic intervention. Well, I'll save that for a future episode. But
we need a future episode just on that.
I just want to point out that there were people well aware of the allegations against Borzot who chose not to while she was involved in like the training, while she was involved in the sort of off the grid organization that was going to help determine some of the training realities. And now there's been denials about that, but you can go read David Bronner's various letters about that. We'll throw that in the reading section too. But like the reality is these people have been at the core of some of the pushes around mainstreaming and medicalization, or at least pseudo-medicalization, and there has been a lack of willingness by people within the community to actually uproot that and remove the tremendous potential for harm from the communities that they're a part of and from the efforts that they have championed. And to my mind, that's a problem.
And I want to say one thing before we close, which is that there's been a lot of discussion around sort of self-regulation and making sure that psychedelics puts its best foot forward as we enter into a therapeutic paradigm as mainstreaming occurs. And I just want to say that this is exactly what it looks like. Because if anybody thought that mainstreaming was going to happen without these things coming to light, either the history of it or the ongoing practice of it, that's a persistent delusion. And it's one that we're hoping to disabuse people of, because we're adults and we need to have adult conversations about powerful drugs, and nuance is actually a good thing.
Hear, hear.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's maybe a good place to wrap today's episode of Power Tripping. Thanks so much, guys, for putting your brains on this, and to our listeners for coming along for the ride. And do feel free to hit us up on our tip line if you have information for us, or to get in touch if there's specific questions or things you want us to talk about on a later episode of Power Tripping. Yeah, we really appreciate people's engagement with this subject matter. We're obviously all very passionate about it. And there is an extra episode of Power Trip that's coming out next week. So we will
There's
be
just
back.
so much shit we need to expand.
We need a second
the show.
hallway.
And
We
a
need
bigger
a second
septic
hallway.
tank, people.
And just a reminder, Symposia is a nonprofit, completely volunteer-run organization. If you appreciate the work that we do and will continue to do, we would certainly appreciate your support. You can support us on Patreon or via other channels. Everything is listed at symposia.com/donate. Your support means a hell of a lot to us, and also means that we can continue to field the disclosures and take on the type of work that feels incredibly important to us. So thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Bye.